Morning, everybody. I am very pleased to be with you for this interesting colloquium on Africa. My panel will be on structural changes after COVID-19. And I just wanted to let you know that I am in Geneva. And so, I had to control also the timing. I am very pleased to introduce to you three excellent speakers. First of all, let me just mention their names so I can give them enough time to speak. First of all, David Francis from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, University of Wits. Well, the name is very long, no? And he is, somebody very knowledgeable on the issues of labor market economics, the informal economy, and inequality. He was a researcher for the advisory panel on the minimum wage in South Africa. He has previously worked as a development consultant and a policy and budget analyst at the South Africa's National Treasury, where he worked in health and social policy. He has a master in development study from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and a Bachelor of Social Sciences in Economics and History from the University of Cape Town. So I am very pleased to introduce David. The second speaker will be Javier Zakristan, who is from UNAM. He has a major in history. Has coordinated the diploma on Asia and African Studies and participates in the 50 years of the commemoration of the student movement in 1968 as a coordinator. He collaborates with the program on studies of Asia and Africa in UNAM, and he teaches the history of sub-Saharan Africa from the 18th to 21st century in the Faculty of Philosophy at UNAM. Then I have also Carlos Oya, who is a professor of political economy of development at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London, and developing economics by training. He has done extensive field-based research on contemporary labor market dynamism in various African countries and has recently led a project on structural transformations and employment outcomes in infrastructure construction and manufacturing sectors in Ethiopia and Angola, two LDCs, and he's a co-editor of the Journal of Agrarian Change. For myself, I am very pleased to be part of this meeting. I think I am going to learn a lot, and I followed the words of my previous speaker when she said that María Paula Meneses, who said this, yes, we can think and act from the South. Okay, go ahead. With no more time, I give the floor to David Francis. Okay. Do you hear me, David? Yes?
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, David. Yes.
Great. Thanks, Álvarez. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I'm just going to put my presentation up.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, in the time allotted to me today, I'm going to be...
Let's go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, my presentation is just frozen for a second. There we go. So I'm going to be giving a bit of a descriptive overview of the labor market in South Africa, particularly thinking about inequalities and what the COVID pandemic means for how we think about inequality in the South African labor market. So the first thing that I'll touch on is a little bit why we should be worried about inequality in South Africa. Those more familiar with our context won't be surprised that it's a problem, but perhaps the extent of it might be surprising to some. And then really, from a very simple methodological approach, just using the latest national labor statistics to answer the question of what has happened in our labor market in 2020 as a result of COVID, and what does that mean given the state we were in before COVID for how we think about where the big structural changes are happening and what that means for inequality between various groups of people and spatially in South Africa. And as I'll show in a bit, I think it's particularly important. This is a kind of central question in South Africa's political economy beyond just the economic question, which is because we have some of the highest unemployment in the world, if not the highest in our kind of group of countries. So, what effect has COVID had on that, and how can we maybe think about some ways out of the mess that we're in? So just to lay out the rather sorry and sad picture of the South African kind of economy before COVID. So this is maybe taking us up to 2019. So we already have extremely high unemployment, just around 29%, according to a narrow definition. So that's people who are looking for work, can't find it, 29% of the working age population. Then added to that, we have some of the highest inequality in the world. So we know that amongst income, if we use the income measure, we have the highest income inequality in the world. Maybe we get displaced every now and again by one or two other countries, but we're amongst the worst. It's harder to know about wealth. If we think about wealth, how unequal are we? Because data for wealth is pretty poor, but some of my colleagues at the center have been doing some really interesting work in the last 2 years and trying to kind of quantify, if you look at wealth, where are we? And we're again amongst the worst. And then, of course, we have pervasive racial inequality between race groups because of colonialism and apartheid. And we have, what I'm going to focus on a little bit more today, pervasive gender inequality between men and women. And then again, unsurprisingly, we have inequality between those who have jobs. We have extremely high income inequality. The high earners earn many times multiples of what low earners earn. And then obviously we have high inequality between those who are employed and those who are unemployed as well. And then really concerningly, and it's an issue that hasn't got much attention in policy discussions in South Africa, for a developing country, we have growing poverty according to kind of the basic headline poverty rates. And I think it's a really worrying thing, and it makes us an anomaly in some ways. Since about 2015, our poverty rates have started to increase after 20 or 25 years of declining since the end of the apartheid era. And it's something that hasn't been explicit, but it's showing up in cracks in the social fabric, in a lot of ways in the kind of political economy. And that's largely as a result, amongst other things, of the fact that our economic growth is very low. And again, since about 2015, we've had declining per capita income. And I know those are very crude measures of well-being in an economy, but they give us some idea of why we have the problems that we have. And this is just a map, just to put us in context. I've talked a lot about South Africa. This is a visual depiction of income inequality around the world. And cracks in the social fabric. See that South Africa, the darker the green, the higher your income inequality. Depending on the exact measure, we're the worst or one of the worst. And also interestingly, in the context of this colloquium, thinking that map shows how inequality is, in terms of the magnitude, is really very acute in much of the global south. But there's lots of discussion about inequality in the global north, and I think welcome this kind of south-south discussion on such an important issue, because you can see clearly this is where inequality bites, and that just shows you, if you take some of the top 30 most unequal countries, South Africa is the worst. So we're already in trouble. This data is pre-COVID. It's too soon afterwards to get some indication of what COVID has done to our inequality, but from what we'll talk about next, the assumption is that it's only worsened it. And so just to put us in perspective, this is a graph of unemployment in South Africa and compared to our sub-Saharan African counterparts, including South Africa. And I mean, the gap there is very marked. South Africa is the top of the kind of really brown color, and sub-Saharan Africa is the blue line at the bottom. And we really have a kind of periodization of three periods in the early transition period and the post-apartheid period until around 2000s. We have broadly stable unemployment, very high at 30% of all working people, but stable. And then us, like many developing countries, there's a commodity boom in the early 2000s that fuels economic growth in South Africa. Jobs are created and unemployment falls. And then from around the time of the global financial crisis, unemployment starts to rise and rise slowly but consistently in the last 10 years, both in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Africa, but again, orders of magnitude worse in South Africa. So I wanted to think, with a brief of thinking about structural changes, where, how's the composition, that kind of headline unemployment number obscures a lot of really interesting information about what's happening in the labor market. And so I went and had a look at the official statistics. This is a 12-year picture from the first quarter in 2008, so before the financial crisis, to the first quarter in 2020, which is before these data stop in March. So it was before we had any COVID impacts. And we see really, we've had some growth in employment. We grew from 14.5 million employed people in 2008 to 16.4 in 2020. That's a 13% growth. But that, if you look at the breakdown, that growth is largely driven by the informal sector, percentage-wise, which grew at 20%. But the concerning thing is the unemployment. Our unemployment grew by 2.3 million people over that period, which was a 61% increase in unemployment. So it's not that we haven't created jobs. We have created jobs, but our unemployment keeps growing because our workforce is growing much faster than the economy can create jobs, and it's a worry. The other one that's notable is the growth in discouraged work seekers. So in South Africa, they have a narrow definition of unemployment, which is people who want jobs and are looking for them. And then we have an additional group, which is people who would have a job if they could find one, but they've become disillusioned and they no longer look for work. And that increased by 1.7 million people in the same period, from about 1.2 million to close on 3 million. So almost as many people as got jobs in that time gave up looking for work entirely. So it's a fairly bleak picture. And I'm going through some of the detail just to try and give some of the nuance to how our labor market's structured and where its challenges are. So then now if we look at unemployment and we include COVID, we see something quite remarkable. The big V dip is there as a definitional anomaly, because to be unemployed, you have to be looking for work. And during the lockdown, you can't look for work because you're confined by law to your house. And so there's this big dip, and the labor market statistics came out after this quarter that covered the lockdown, and unemployment had dropped. And it's something that prompted a lot of debates in the country. But then the trend carries on, and by the end of 2020, we see unemployment has skyrocketed up from about 29% before COVID to 33%. And so it's something that we're really concerned about. And here, this is flipping that the other way and saying, well, who's employed? So unemployment, as we said, masks a whole lot of other dynamics about people who are not looking for jobs. And here you just see employment in South Africa falling off a cliff during COVID. And that's partly a result of the lockdown. And that's the big steep drop that you see from March to June last year. We lost about 2.5 million jobs, which is significant given our working population. And then it starts to rebound. And the question we're asking is, going forward, how will those jobs rebound and who will get them? Who will get reemployed? Who lost their jobs and who gets reemployed? And that's a really important question, I think, for thinking about inequality in the labor market, because it's very unlikely that those who get jobs now is just going to be a random group of those who lost jobs. There's going to be structural determinants for who wins and who loses in the next period. And regardless of that, we're 7 years back. As I said, we've had job creation in the last 10 years, but it's been fairly poor. But even with that poor job creation, we've been set back. In the second quarter of 2020, we're now back in terms of the total number of people employed as we were in 2014. And of course, the labor market has grown. And so unemployment continues to rise. So then the question is who is losing out from the lockdowns and from the economic impact of COVID? And why should we worry about that from an inequality perspective? So this is now comparing within 2020, so before and after COVID, from the first 3 months of the year before we had our first COVID case, and from the last 3 months of the year, October, November, and December. So over that period, we had a slight rebound in job creation, and about 1.4 million people lost their jobs. That's the highlighted in green over here. So that's an 8% job loss overall, which is obviously very bad in and of itself. But one of the telling things is, if we then think about the formal sector and the informal sector, quite broadly defined, the formal sector lost more jobs in total because it's more people work there, 11 million people work there, but twice as many people in the informal sector lost their jobs. And the informal sector is a sector that's precarious. It's in South Africa, it employs a lot of women. It's a very, it pays low incomes. It doesn't have very much job security. So these are people who in the labor market are precarious already, are now being disproportionately affected by COVID. And it's not hard to understand why in the first 5-week lockdown that we had, for most of that, informal traders were banned from trading. A formal grocery store was allowed to continue to operate, but an informal trader was prohibited. And that's had a really negative effect on people who work in the informal sector. And that's something that I think we need to really be concerned about if we think about employment policy in South Africa. The other one to think about is private households. That's our statistics agency's term for domestic workers, who again are precarious, and a mix of formal and informal sector, again, disproportionately lost their jobs. The other question, thinking of our long trajectory, is, if we have our hopes as an industrializing country that creates jobs through growth, and there's often, wishes of countries like South Africa to grow their manufacturing sectors and industrialize as a way to generate economic growth and generate job creation. What does the picture look like if we look at those sectors? And again, it's not very good news. For one, if we think about the pre-COVID period, again from 2008 to before COVID in 2020, our manufacturing sector actually declined over that period by 20% in terms of employment. So already one of our big hopes for economic growth and job creation was not good. We lost 400,000 jobs. And then we lost another 200,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector as a result of COVID. And the picture is pretty grim across a number of these different sectors, including construction. It's understandable why that would be affected by the lockdowns. The other one was community and social services that got hit fairly hard and employs a lot of people. So that just gives kind of some pause for thought about, what does this mean for our industrial policy, for our our growth-led job creation strategy that the country is pursuing. So that's quite a lot of numbers. I want to just think now a little bit higher level about, where can we, where are areas of concern and where are there going to be structural changes emerging in the labor market, which was problematic before COVID and is now become even more so. And the first, as I mentioned, I think we need to be concerned about the informal economy. This is an area that, in South African policy is not prioritized. There's a lot of there's a lot of anti-informality policing. People have their goods confiscated. It's not an environment that supports the informal economy. And now the double whammy is that the COVID crisis, and particularly the way the lockdowns were structured, has caused a lot of people who are already precarious to lose their income. And they weren't covered. The government had some level of income support as part of the COVID response, but it was not accessible to informal workers. It worked through the tax system and the employment insurance system, which didn't cover workers. The second, I think, is that, and this is a question that labor market economists, I think, should think about more, and we don't have much data to do so, is we see this turbulence, we see these job losses and then these job gains, but that doesn't tell us at the high level about what are the kind of jobs that people are getting back. So we've lost 2.5 million jobs, and now 1 million people have been re-employed. But it would be, I think, naive to assume that they've been re-employed at the same conditions. They might have lost a formal job or a high-paying informal job, and then now, perhaps are a delivery driver on a 0 hours contract, or they're working somewhere in the informal sector. And we need, I think, the project for us in the next year is to try and understand more, how has this churning happened? Who's got a job again and maybe doesn't show up in the unemployment numbers, but has got a significantly worse job? The third area, I think, that's very striking, and it's not showing up just in South Africa but around the world, is the gendered impact of COVID. And there's quite a lot of writing about how, in general, financial crises like the one in 2008 disproportionately are bad for men, because men still disproportionately hold a lot of jobs in the financial services sector that get lost when that kind of crisis happens. But the COVID crisis is the reverse. Because of the gendered nature and distribution of paid and unpaid work has hurt women much more. And we've seen this from the global north, from data from Canada and from the south, that women are disproportionately affected. And one area for us where that shows is in that big drop in informal employment that I mentioned. There was a 20% drop for women compared to a 9% drop for men. So again, it's the more precarious and the more marginalized within the labor market, the harder those groups have been hit by COVID and the lockdowns. And then I think the fourth question that's interesting, and again, perhaps too soon to have the answer, but it ties into questions about the role of technology and the future of work, and what we in South Africa seem to call the fourth industrial revolution, is what is the kind of social distancing requirements and the lockdown, what does that mean for increasing capital intensity in an economy like South Africa that is already fairly capital intensive? What kind of structural changes in our capital composition is that going to mean? And what does that mean for our job creation ambitions in South Africa? And then, of course, the fifth area of concern in the labor market is unsurprisingly inequality, and it's kind of self-evident why that's the case. So, what are the ways I think that we can think about going forward? I've just sort of given relentlessly bad news, but how can we think about some solutions to this? I mean, again, as I said, it's clear that one of the things that the crisis has illuminated is the gendered nature of our problem. And there's also a racialized nature and a geographical nature, but today I'm thinking about the gender problem. I mean, at one point in the middle of the lockdown, of the 3 million people that had lost their jobs, 2 million were women, according to one survey. So I think the pandemic has really heightened that we have a real gender skew. There's often talk about the pay gap and those kind of things, the gender pay gap, but I think the COVID crisis has shown just how widespread and acute this problem is. And I think one thing that's frustrating is that we don't lack either the theoretical tools or options from around the world about ways that we can think in a more gendered, holistic way about work and thinking about paid work and unpaid work. But in South Africa, certainly the response has been fairly muted about how we can tackle our employment problem and our gender problem at the same time. I think the other thing that the pandemic has highlighted, and we're starting to see this shift in the talking of policymakers and politicians, is that we can't just talk about job creation strategies that's led by economic growth. We have, I think, sometimes explicitly, sometimes less explicitly, pinned our hopes for economic recovery and job on kind of a broad thinking of economic growth and an investment climate, and hoping that the jobs follow. And I think that those numbers that I showed at the beginning about the extent of our unemployment problem show that we need a much more radical and explicit focus on job creation rather than just on economic growth as our first outcome. And I think in many ways that's starting to be seen. For the first time, our president mentioned that the government is looking into universal basic income, which is something that's quite unprecedented in our kind of political discourse. It was raised in the 90s, but ever since has fallen away. So I think it's encouraging that there's now some more innovative and radical thinking, but exactly how we tackle these problems and the policies we choose to be decided. I think that's my time up, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, David. I will then pass the microphone, the floor, to Sacristán, and then we are going to have all the questions all together during the Q&A period, which is, we have 50 minutes then. Then Javier, welcome, and I will just give the floor to you now. Okay, it's okay. I don't think there is any problem. There is any problem. Go ahead, please. Thank you very much, Javier. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I can see you now. Thank you. It was very interesting. And we come back to you on the Q&A session. Now I pass the floor to Mr. Oya. Carlos Oya, please go ahead. Are you there? Okay, Carlos.
Hello. Can you? Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yes, we hear you. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I'm going to share my screen. But just before, thank you for the invitation to this important colloquium. It's a pleasure to continue my collaboration with UNAM in these matters and share some of the recent research that we've been undertaking at SOAS on COVID-related issues. As the title of my presentation suggests, I'm going to focus on some of the challenges that one of the countries in Africa that has been trying harder in terms of industrializing in the last 5 to 10 years. One of the challenges that this country has faced with the COVID pandemic, and particularly in the way the COVID pandemic has affected global production networks, to which Ethiopia has been incorporated gradually over the past 10 years. So I'm going to share my screen. Is it visible to everyone? Yeah. Can you all see it?
Okay, now.
Yes. Okay, so the question I'm addressing is whether COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis associated with the pandemic, particularly the impact of lockdowns throughout the world, can threaten the aspirations to industrialize in Ethiopia. That is the sort of question I'm trying to tackle in this presentation. And therefore, I'm going to just give you an overview of what I will try to cover in this 20 minutes or so. First of all, document the impressive progress that Ethiopia has made in the last 10 years, particularly in terms of industrial takeoff, particularly in relation to the light manufacturing. So in a sense, Ethiopia is following to an extent sort of the maquiladora model with some variations. But what this shows is by and large a very strong aspiration to industrialize in a country that had failed to do so for a very long time. Part of this has to do with very significant efforts of the recent period in infrastructure building, industrial hub development, i.e. the building of industrial parks, and policies to attract foreign direct investors, primarily from Asia, i.e. Suppliers inserted in global production networks in the textile and apparel industry, which are now increasingly relocating or expanding from their Asian bases. So these are the pillars of Ethiopian strategy. So what we know is that the impact of COVID-19, particularly in March, June, so the very earlier period, was very, very significant. Obviously, Ethiopia was not the only one. I will show us a few examples beyond Ethiopia, which basically showed how vulnerable certain global value chains and global production networks, such as textile and apparel, are to disruptions of the kind that we've seen in the last 12 months. Of course, there have been responses, coping strategies, particularly responses from governments and also from donor agencies. And we don't know yet the full extent of their effects, but there's some indication. So I'm going to also mention some of those responses, particularly from the Ethiopian government. And then I will finish with a few recommendations in relation to the problematic of the resilience of global value chains, and particularly global value chains like textile and apparel that seem especially vulnerable to these shocks. So let me just first making a few comments on the African aspirations to industrialize. And this requires a little bit of historical perspective, because this is not the first time that some African countries have attempted to follow an industrialization model. The first wave really happened, particularly in the 1960s up to the mid-1970s, but came to an end with the 1970s crisis and the arrival of structural adjustments and neoliberal reforms of the 1980s and 90s. This led to what some development economists, such as Danny Roderick, has called premature de-industrialization. This is indeed arguably applicable to a number of African countries that show a actually decline in relative and absolute terms in terms of manufacturing value added per capita, but that cannot be generalized throughout the continent. It is also true that a significant number of African countries didn't go that far in terms of industrialization in that early period either. Now, after years of reforms, structural adjustment, and the deepening of primary commodity dependence, which has happened as part of the commodity boom of the 2000s, i.e. more and more African countries are actually now more dependent on these primary commodity exports. Yet some countries have begun to undertake a revival of their industrial ambitions. This has been reflected in the way industrial policy has come back at the center of policy agendas, particularly in certain African countries. But I would like to suggest that despite the fact that indeed some international organizations such as the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNDP, some bilateral donors such as the old DFID, FCDO, but also the German Cooperation, despite the fact that they have kind of embarked also on reviving these discussions, much of this revival has been driven by African governments and some African policymakers themselves. So this is an interesting example, again, of agency being recovered in the context of many, many decades of structural adjustment reforms and continuous dependence on external policy framework, externally driven policy framework. Now, although more and more African governments have put industrialization at the center of their agendas, only a handful of these countries have really advanced in the industrialization agenda substantially, especially in the last 10 years. So particularly Ethiopia, this is probably one of the best examples, which started from a low base, but also partly Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Nigeria. Indeed, as the previous speaker mentioned, South Africa is an outlier because South Africa has actually continued with its manufacturing decline, despite being the powerhouse of manufacturing production within sub-Saharan Africa. But all these countries have indeed made some substantial efforts that need to be recognized. And Ethiopia really stands out because it's probably the country in the continent that has shown a bolder commitment towards industrialization, but also a more coherent strategic approach to industrialization, one that puts policy learning at the center. So the Ethiopian government is quite adamant that what they're doing is following a continuous learning process. They're not trying to implement any particular model, and that indeed this policy learning process has happened. So let me illustrate some evidence that suggests that indeed something is beginning to happen, and there are some changes that seem to suggest a reversal of this premature de-industrialization that I mentioned before. So although in relative terms, we still see very, very low levels in terms of manufacturing value added as a proportion of GDP, we also see that in constant terms, there has been a significant picking up, especially from the mid-2000s onwards. Obviously, in relative terms, this is not that clear, partly also because primary commodity exports and primary commodity sectors have benefited from these very high prices for some time. So this is in partly offsetting this. But we cannot really neglect the reality that manufacturing sectors are picking up in many parts of Africa. And this is actually visible. You just need to visit some of these countries to really see industrial parks and factories that were basically non-existent only 20 years ago. A recent analysis by a group of researchers that have generated a new database are actually also trying to look at it in relative terms by predicting the employment share by region and showing that actually sub-Saharan Africa, excluding Mauritius, which is another outlier, has indeed substantially increased more than what would be expected by its level of income per capita, has substantially increased its manufacturing share in employment. And this is particularly striking in terms of its contrast with Latin America, as you can see here, but also with the full sample of developing countries that you see in the other graph below. So there's something really is going on, and official statistics are beginning to capture this. In Ethiopia, this also comes with very substantial industrial job creation. So the growth in manufacturing jobs has been quite remarkable. And interestingly, a lot of this growth in formal manufacturing jobs has been driven by foreign direct investments, with Chinese firms acting as catalysts of these processes of change. So there's an interesting dynamic here of firms coming from Asia primarily, but also from countries such as Turkey, that have really taken the lead in terms of relocating or expanding their manufacturing operations towards countries like Ethiopia. Madagascar is another example, but Ethiopia is really standing out. And by and large, this hasn't happened naturally. It has happened to a large extent thanks to the very substantial efforts that the Ethiopian government and some of its partners have made in terms of creating the basic conditions for these manufacturing industrial investments to take place in Ethiopia, pretty much against the odds, because nobody really expected this to happen only 15 years ago. Now, with COVID-19, obviously, there is a real threat. So as I say, what has happened in Ethiopia is relatively recent, especially the acceleration of manufacturing employment and manufacturing sector has happened pretty much since 2014 onwards. So, we're talking 4 or 5 years. Many of the new investors in these new industrial parks in Ethiopia only started operations in 2017-18. So they are only in the very early stages of their manufacturing operations. And many of these investors are actually connected to these global production networks or global value chains. So in a sense, this is a very critical period, because it is a period, you can see it as a period of probation, like when you're employed and you go through probation, and then you might, be made permanent or not. So what is at stake in Ethiopia is whether this process of early industrialization will be irreversible or not, or we will see a substantial reversal of the trends that we've seen in the last few years. And COVID-19 impact has something to say about that threat. What we know from labor market dynamics more generally, there has been a study by the ILO recently, but mainly looking at short-term changes, particularly looking at the period towards until August. And it did the Ethiopian economy, like many other African economies, were severely impacted. Ethiopia was quite serious, quite solid in terms of its lockdown measures in the early stages. They reacted very, very quickly. And as you know, the Ethiopian state, can be quite strong in terms of enforcing some of these regulations. So obviously, many parts of the economy were affected, and this is partly reflected in these increase in unemployment rates. Bear in mind, and I think this is an important point to make for many other African countries, that by and large, these unemployment rates might not seem very high, but by and large, most people in Ethiopia cannot afford to be unemployed. So this is actually quite a desperate situation when you see those rates going up. But perhaps what really is more remarkable, more important to note, is the changes in mean wages, and particularly the unequal impact of COVID-19 on different groups of workers, with blue-collar agricultural production and transportation workers being particularly affected compared to those who actually could work from home. So in a sense, what's happening in Ethiopia is not necessarily that different from what we've seen in high-income countries when it comes to the unequal impact of the lockdown measures on different types of jobs and different types of sectors. Now, a survey that was conducted early on in those stages around May 2020 already showed that manufacturers in Ethiopia, and this was a survey primarily for foreign direct investors and many of these companies that had set business only a few years before, So most of them were really experiencing reduced revenue, productivity. There were concerns about the financial viability, but also interestingly, there were also concerns about employee retention, because they thought that the suspension of operations as a result of the cancellation of orders or as a result of lockdown measures could lead employees to basically leave these jobs and leave these sectors, which might be counterintuitive, but in the Ethiopian context, it's not that counterintuitive. So what some manufacturers tried to do, and at that time they were willing to do, was to repurpose production, i.e. this retooling process, whereby they would move, for example, to the production of PPE equipment, which was possible for some of them, not for all, but certainly for some of them, or to entirely repurpose to other manufacturing processes. Initially, manufacturers also showed willingness to support the workers, even if they were not working, as a sort of furlough scheme, but only for a very limited period. They were quite adamant that if suspensions of operations were protracted, they would have to lay off workers. Whereas for the Ethiopian government, it was absolutely essential that workers were not laid off in that early shock period. So at that time, the manufacturers were really expecting something to come from the government in order to see what they could do. What they were facing at that moment, like many other suppliers in many other countries in Asia particularly, was basically the suspension of operations because demand had plummeted, because the big brands, the big buyers had stopped buying and had to cancel those orders. So here's an illustration of that process for India and Bangladesh, two very important suppliers of textile and apparel products. And you can see there the lost value in terms of millions of dollars just in that period of March to June, where operations pretty much came to a halt, particularly in the month of April. Why was that? Precisely because of the sudden cancellation of orders, which had already been sent, okay? And I think this is a problem that happened more or less across the board that shows some of the lack of resilience of these kind of global supply chains. Has that changed significantly in the last few months? I mean, if you go further after May, June, has the behavior of these big global brands massively changed? Unfortunately, not so much, judging by the research that Mark Anner and the Workers' Rights Council has conducted in the context of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a very good representative of this situation. So as you can see here, by September, October, there was still a very large proportion of companies which reported that less than 25% of the cancelled orders had been paid in full. So this is all money that had not gone into these companies which did not have the financial cushion to overcome this crisis. So this all shows a number of basic problems and very, very significant challenges to the resilience of these global value chains, which also calls into question the pertinence of incorporation into these global production networks. The first problem is the excessive power of a few lead firms, buyers and brands, and the dependence on their behavior and whether they want to please their customers, they want to please the corporate social responsibility which they tend to solve or not. And here we need to distinguish between buyers such as Inditex, what people know as Zara, which are very, very committed to sort of protecting the supply chain as far as possible, with other medium-sized brands such as, say, Mango and others, which have much less capacity to withstand the lockdown and the crisis that happened in 2020. So for these other medium-sized brands, the ability to actually say, okay, we will continue our orders is very, very limited. So a lot of the focus has been on these big brands, the PVH, Inditex, Vanity Fair, H&M, and so on. And they have all Walmart, and they all have shown quite different behavior in relation to their orders. But generally, most of these brands are characterized by these global production networks are characterized by two issues which are particularly damaging for suppliers, for manufacturers. This is what we call the double squeeze. The squeeze by the flexibility of orders. They always have to sort of catch up with orders that go up and down depending on what the brands want. And they can lose them very, very easily. And secondly, the tight margins under which they have to operate. So if they lose orders at any given point in time, the financial implication for these companies is huge, to the point that some may be forced to close down. What brands did that was very, very naughty in this process, especially in March, April, May, was the recourse to the force majeure in the contracts. So they avoided honoring the contracts for those orders. And that shows a very significant legal loophole, which really shows the lack of resilience of this global production chain. So this is why also those of us who've been studying these issues, and also people who are working in this industry, one of the things we're saying and calling is that these clauses of force majeure need to be removed now. And there is obviously a pushback from the big buyers and big brands to keep them in the clauses, because this is where the main power lies. The other problem is that most suppliers in Asia, and particularly in Africa, have a limited access to finance so that they can cushion the shocks. Whereas the big brands and the buyers do have much easier access to finance when it comes to bailouts, for example. Again, this asymmetry is highly problematic, because at the end of the day, you need the manufacturers to produce these textiles and garments. And finally, in the industry, there has been generally, up until now, or at least in the early stages of this crisis, quite limited government and donor support. And that compounded, exacerbated some of these problems. So let me just show you some of the responses that took place in Ethiopia. I mean, what is it that the Ethiopian government actually did in order to try to help the industry stay afloat? Because as you can see, for the Ethiopian government, it was absolutely crucial to make sure that the ambitions to industrialize were not killed by a crisis lasting a few months. Now, they came up with a number of components of different interventions. And as you can see from all of them, they were not particularly ambitious. Why? It's not surprising. The Ethiopian government has a very limited fiscal capacity to really go, for example, for what has happened in Europe, which is these furlough schemes. They basically have no money or grants to give enterprise suppliers, manufacturers to pay the salaries of workers that have been left idle. So they had to look at other ways of attenuating the impact of the crisis. For example, they did a lot in terms of prevention and protection in industrial parks, so invest in a lot of resources, therefore removing that need from the companies themselves to improve the health and hygiene of the places where this production was taking place. They maintained production and export performance targets, but also they relaxed some of the requirements that the government has for some of these suppliers in terms of the need to export, so that they could also sell in the domestic market if the export markets have plummeted. They also push for training for those workers who were left idle, for productivity, and they partner with a number of institutions in order to provide this training without a cost. They did support on running a cost burden, so basically reducing some of the costs that are under the control of the government, particularly for working capital loans, for logistics costs, and so on and so forth. And then there is also the responses of certain enterprises, there's state enterprises like Ethiopian Airlines, which were crucial, not just for the survival of Ethiopian Airlines itself. Ethiopian Airlines is a fascinating example of survival. It's the best airline in terms of how they coped with the crisis, but also because they coped with the crisis and they managed to confront the short-term shock, they managed also to support some of these manufacturing enterprises in terms of accessing logistics at a subsidized cost. More recently, I'm talking now September 2020, October, finally donors and international partners got their act together and they introduced a kind of furlough scheme, a wage subsidy scheme, whereby these donors would pay part, at least a significant part of the wages and salaries of employees who were about to be laid off or who could not be kept in the job. And they also introduced a reward system yes. Yeah. And they also introduced a reward system which...
Yeah, go ahead. Finish, please. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yes.
So reward system...
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So they introduced a reward system that consisted essentially on awards to help factories that had been engaging retooling and repurposing, and then give them grants in order to reward that. So we don't really know the early impact because it is very, very early to know. But at least the industry hasn't fallen apart, and you still have a significant number of companies which are still potentially operational or fully operational. So this is my final slide and my final comments on the question whether the crisis can threaten the aspirations to industrialize. So it is quite clear that the crisis has shown the limited resilience of upper and light manufacturing value chains, but this raises an opportunity in terms of campaigns that will push for building resilience within these value chains. And this would imply some changes in the norms and the governance of these value chains, particularly on the side of the big brands and the big buyers. The other big lesson is that coordinated interventions are needed to tackle both the short and the medium-term effects of shocks like COVID. So the amalgamation of different types of intervention doesn't help if there isn't a coherent package where government, donor agencies, private business, large brands, etc., come together, trade unions come together in order to support these global value chains. But by and large, countries like Ethiopia will remain vulnerable to this flexible sourcing, which may lead, investors to other host countries. So the resilience is always going to be relatively limited. But the last comment to make really is that despite the fact that the lessons from COVID-19 can indeed create momentum and improve the situation, if this is taken seriously, unfortunately, what we know now is that the biggest threat to Ethiopia's industrialization probably is not COVID-19, but the political instability and the violence that has unfortunately settled in the country since November. And I'll finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I'm sorry, we have to, give time for everything. Now I am going to pass to the Q&A session. But before that, in order to facilitate, the responses from the different speakers, I would like to ask them, first of all, if they can pass their presentations to the team in UNAM. And it's another thing. I am going to draw the questions, all the questions that I have received, and my own questions as well, at the beginning, and then we give the floor in the same order that speakers spoke during this excellent session. On the first question, it will be for David. What are the key vulnerabilities that the COVID pandemic has highlighted in the South African economy? And what are some of the policies available to address them? Regarding, I will give the time for you to reply, to give your, to elaborate on that. Then on the session where Javier Zakristan was speaking, I will have the possibility to launch or to introduce the idea, which is also very important, of the negotiations of the African Free Trade Area, which is also a very challenging momentum for Africa and also a lesson for other regions. But particularly on the presentation by Javier, I was very much attracted by the advantages he has mentioned on the as a result of the COVID of the pandemic on crop farming, agricultural labor, and opportunities to change consumption patterns. So please elaborate on that. And on the presentation, the excellent presentation of Carlos Roya, of course, I would like you to elaborate on the possible solutions or that we could, envisage. And if you can elaborate on resilience, particularly in the context of COVID-19. You have already mentioned some of the issues, but if you want to elaborate more on that. And then I have also very important questions from the floor. These questions are the following, and they have been passed to me. And if there is any other, please go ahead and do it. Now, what is the difference between the social and economic effects for the pandemic, the pandemic on coronavirus and other pandemics? These are questions which you will feel free to answer, all of you or one of you. The other one is, what is the impact of the human security in the pandemic, on the coronavirus pandemic? The other one is, how could the conflict in Tigray affect Ethiopia's industrialization and economic growth? And there is a last one for the moment, which are the effects that ethnic minorities are experiencing for the pandemic of coronavirus. We have enough time. We have more or less 45 minutes. So please go ahead. First of all, David, and then Javier, and then Carlos. I give you the floor. Okay. David,
Great.
please.
Great.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that to your question about the vulnerabilities, I think what the pandemic showed is how limited the economic space is for the South African government to react to COVID. So we've seen, if we look at the global north, the stimulus package in the United States or the huge spending in the UK are two examples, but there are actually many countries in the global south that have been able to increase spending, provide stimulus, provide unemployment packages. And the South African government, the South African state rather, is in a bit of a tight corner, because at the same time that we're having to address the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic, we're also under international pressure from rating agencies and the like to constrain our spending. And so we've just had our new budget for 2021-22 announced about 3 weeks ago. And it's essentially an austerity budget. There's real declines in a whole lot of different spending. Social grants have not been increased by inflation. There's cuts to security and schools and justice. And I think at the same time that much of the world is spending more, providing stimulus and responding in a kind of accommodating way, the South African state is doing quite the opposite. And it's not, I'm not suggesting that the state is malicious, but it's a reflection of the kind of context and location that South Africa finds itself in. And so I talked a lot about unemployment, the vulnerabilities within the labor market in the formal and the informal sector. And all of those, I think are clear that that's where the problems are, but we have very limited space, or maybe we don't have the imagination to think about, a more progressive way to respond rather than just the austerity kind of approach that I think that we've taken. And I mean, it's a contested terrain, obviously, but I think, so the response is it's a hotly debated topic here, is what can we actually do to address some of the problems, and those that say we need to act within the kind of macro fiscal constraints of the global finance system say we don't have options to spend, and they're those who say that we, regardless of that, we should be providing more stimulus and expanding our spending. And I'm not quite sure exactly which or where in between what mix of those two things we could land on. I wanted to answer a question I think that you didn't mention that was in the group, which is why has the job impact of COVID been disproportionate on women? And the question said, is this due to the role of women in the informal economy, and because the informal economy has been most affected? And that's certainly true. There are a lot of women in the informal sector. But beyond that, there's still a highly gendered distribution of work across different sectors and types of work, because of the kind of historical evolution of the South African economy. And so there's still disproportionately a lot of women in low-paid jobs and in service sector jobs, retail, working in sales and shops, or in personal services like hairdressing. And those are all the things that get hit the hardest by social distancing, and are the most precarious. And so that's why we've seen this disproportionate, effect on women in the economy. The really interesting question about the difference between the social and the economic, I think this is something I tried to allude to at the end of my presentation, that the COVID pandemic has highlighted that kind of distinction is certainly less clear than maybe we would have thought. And part of it's because it's forced work back into the household. Everyone is working at home now. And so the distinctions that we've managed to keep of work, which is what you go out and do for money, and what you do at home, which is not work, becoming increasingly clear that what goes on at home, there's work, but some of it is paid and some of it is unpaid. And actually the distinctions are much less clear. And it points again to the gendered problem, is that some of our surveys are showing that women are now doing vastly more. They've always done more unpaid work in the household, but because of COVID, because everyone's back in their houses, they're doing even disproportionately more than ever before. And that also constrains their ability to work and earn an income. So this link, I think, between the social and the economic, certainly within the household, is much less clear. And I think that provides a clue to the way we can think about some policy going forward, is that we need to think about work more broadly than just paid work in jobs, that work is care work is work that happens in the household and outside the household, and some of it's paid and some of it's not. And maybe there's a clue there to, the way we can think about our kind of labor market policy, but also economic policy as well.
Sorry, David, there are two more questions which are in the chat. If you can access the chat, please. They are directed to you. One of them, can you see them? How does race specifically play in unemployment and economic disparities in South Africa? It's a very long question. If you could read it, I pass it to you through the chat. Can you access it? Yeah. And the other one is, what are the strategies the South African government have taken in the past 10 years? Something about related to COVID as well. You also have it in the chat. Sorry.
Sure, thanks. These are two extremely good and extremely difficult questions. So I'll read the first one. It's, how does race specifically play in unemployment and economic disparities in South Africa, where economic power is racialized towards predominantly the minority white population? That is to say, employers, banks, etc., are primarily whites hiring non-white individuals. And what is the racialization of unemployment? How does race play into the 20 to 25% difference in unemployment in South Africa versus the rest of the continent, where blacks hire blacks? How does South Africa begin to resolve this issue of racialized hiring, firing, and unemployment in action versus the verbiage in the post-apartheid period? I mean, that's the kind of central economic and labor market question. So I certainly don't have an answer, but just to answer the first bit, yeah, I mean, all of those things that we talked about, unemployment, employment, distribution of pay, all cleave very, very strongly racially. So if you look at the racialized statistics, I mean, unemployment amongst white South Africans is close to zero. If you look at it on a graph with unemployment of the other race groups, it's so low, it's negligible. And so there really has been very little progress in undoing the economic power and position of economic privilege of whites in the South African economy. And we've had a process of affirmative action. We've had Black economic empowerment and then broad-based Black economic empowerment. And there certainly is currently a big focus on just what has Black economic empowerment done to address the issues that you point out. Has it actually created new opportunities and distributed economic power and wealth across to Black South Africans, or is it just swapped out at the top some very rich white South Africans for some very rich Black South Africans without fundamentally changing the economic structure? But race, I think, is still essential determinants across all the kind of economic and social metrics, and it is changing, and there are improvements, but they're very slow. And given that we're now 30 years into democratic South Africa, I think the rate of change is certainly not acceptable. And to the question of how do we resolve this? Yeah, it's if you look at it through that lens, most of our economic policy is trying to deal with this question, but it's a very difficult one, and the inertia of economic power in the country is making it extremely hard to undo. Possibly because a lot of the economic policy paradigm is, as I was saying about the austerity budget, is very much within a kind of, well, we're a global economy, we're constrained to act, and perhaps actually, some more decisive or more imaginative action to intervene in addressing some of these problems is worth trying now, rather than claiming that we have our hands tied by our insertion into the global economy. But it's a really tough question. And I think that speaks a bit to the second one, which is in the same way that we haven't been able to address our racialized inequality, we also just haven't been able to address our inequality at all. And it's something one of my colleagues calls the Inequality Paradox. We have this lauded constitution that's extremely progressive, and it enshrines socioeconomic rights, and it compels the government to act in a way that progressively undoes and addresses these inequalities. But the material effect hasn't been nearly, I think, as marked as we thought it would be at the start of the New South Africa. There's inequalities in access to education, severe inequalities within work, between people who work and don't work. And it's a head scratcher to say, why have they failed? There've been a multi-pronged attack on these issues, but with very little to show. And I think the COVID numbers we've seen have showed that it's actually the last year has just made these things worse and has set us back with what little progress we have made in addressing them. So this is not hugely coherent, because the answer to most of those questions, we don't really know why it's not working, and we don't have great ideas of what to do to try the new things. And that's why it's a fairly bleak picture at the moment, I think. Thanks, Chair. I think that's me for the questions.
Well, thank you very much. Now we come, very interesting your question, and just to finalize your part, I just wanted to know if you can say something about, the affirmative action. Is there any impact on that? Because I understand that there is that going on in South Africa. Okay. Does it have any impact on labor? Yeah.
That's a really good question. And I mean, we have, again, similar to the Constitution, we have a raft of very progressive labor legislation which prohibits discrimination in hiring, promotes equality, both ensuring that people who do the same work get paid the same, but also that there aren't huge inequities between people within a firm in terms of their earnings. But I think that that's been successful in some ways, but the magnitude of the structural problem in the economy is so big that just it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition to change the way that the economy works. And so then to augment affirmative action was the implementation of Black economic empowerment, which is trying, instead of post hoc, to change the structure of ownership in the economy in the first instance. But again, it seems, and there's actually a review of BE going on at the moment by some of my colleagues to try and understand where has it been a success and where hasn't. Because ownership is still overwhelmingly concentrated amongst whites. High-paying jobs still are disproportionately held by white South Africans. And so we need to have a really critical look at, has affirmative action and BE been radical enough, or do we need to think of something even more systemic or wide-ranging? Because the high levels, when you look at South Africa in 2020, it doesn't look like it's 30 years into the post-apartheid period. In many ways, it looks very much like the country did in 1995, and that progress is not satisfactory. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Much. Very interesting, your response, and we will look into that, in the future. I hope we can continue working on that. The second, please, Javier, could you please elaborate on your, part of your presentation, particularly on these advantages you could raise from, the hard time we have been living throughout the year related to coronavirus, no? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yes. Mhm. Yes. Yes. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. 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 Okay. Mhm. 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 Well, okay. Yeah, I think this we need to give the time to our next speaker, no, to Carlos. Okay, is that okay? So Carlos, go ahead, and then we can reconvene if there is still time.
Yeah.
Okay, you have more or less.
Yeah, I think
15 minutes.
I've
Okay. Mhm.
I've noted two questions primarily.
Yes.
I mean, your question on the solutions had advanced some ideas there. I think the basic problem with global value chains like textile and apparel that are based on sort of low technology, easy way in, easy way out as well, and very intense competition between supplying countries. So it's not just Asia, but now African countries and indeed some Latin American countries. I think that raises lots of questions in terms of how resilience can be built from within first, and then how different agencies, governments, etc., can build walls outside in order to cushion the impact of these kinds of shocks. Because what the COVID experience has shown is that these value chains are basically vulnerable to any kind of shock that disrupts the supply chain significantly. I mean, this could be shocks in logistics, it could be a pandemic, it could be shocks in relation to perceptions of the situation in certain supplying countries, which might lead brands to leave those countries and so on. So supplying countries like Ethiopia, Bangladesh, etc., are in a very vulnerable position. And that is why also they always try to give as many incentives as possible to manufacturers investing in these countries. So as I say in my presentation, one thing that which should certainly be considered seriously is a review of the contracts currently binding the large brands like H&M, Inditex, etc., and the suppliers across different countries. I mean, Inditex has about 7,000 suppliers in I don't know how many countries. So these are very, very complex global production networks, and they require some basic rules that everyone abides by. And one of them should be the removal of this force majeure clause, which has been clearly abused in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, one needs to appreciate, as I say before in the presentation, that not all brands, not all buyers are in the same predicament. Inditex and all these very big brands have certainly the financial muscle to withstand a sort of crisis associated with lockdowns in Europe or United States, as they did, whereas other medium or small-sized brands are less able to do that. And indeed, we have seen a number of brands really pretty much disappearing from the high street. Now, but I think these sort of changes in the regulation, in the governance of the contracts between suppliers, manufacturers, and brands is absolutely imperative. And that would certainly go a long way in terms of protecting manufacturing companies more than they are at the moment. The other element that I mentioned before, which I think really needs very careful and concerted action, is to really reduce the pernicious effects of this double squeeze that I mentioned in the presentation, i.e. the negative impact of this flexible sourcing and the volatility of orders, which companies always have to respond to, and also the very tight margins at which they operate, which put them always at a very vulnerable position whenever there's a crisis and a shock. And obviously, I mean, I'm saying that not because I care so much about the owners of those companies. It's because at the end of the day, those who suffer the consequences of those tight margins, of those fluctuations in orders, are the workers. I mean, those who are at the bottom of the chain, who have to suffer with low wages, precarious conditions, and basically being laid off whenever there is a reduction in order. So that is one thing that really needs to be tackled head on, and the COVID-19 crisis has provided an opportunity to really rethink these relations. And the other thing is really, as I said before, the more coordinated and concerted actions across different actors in these sectors, including African governments, donor agencies, and the big brands themselves, and indeed also logistics companies, companies that are involved in the logistics of these value chains. Because without that kind of coordination, we can be in situations that could be even worse than what we've seen in the last April, May, June period of crisis. So luckily, the crisis has not been as bad as some people thought back in April, but it could be far worse. For example, if we didn't have all these furlough schemes in Europe and so on. And then finally is the issue that I mentioned on the political stability. I mean, whenever you talk to any of these investors, especially from Asia, I mean, electricity costs come first, and then labor costs also are up there in the hierarchy of issues. But political stability is always there. I mean, it's usually taken for granted, and they say, well, I would never invest in this country if it was in turmoil. So clearly, in the context of Ethiopia, the current situation and what happened since November is deeply troubling, not least because of the loss of life, of the situation in Tigray. And then coming back to the question on Tigray, is not, as been said by the government, is not really a law enforcement operation. I mean, it is a sort of low intensity now, but localized civil war with militias operating and being fought by the Ethiopian forces, and even with a foreign army in presence, the Eritrean army, as has been very recently confirmed by the BBC and other news outlets, and creating lots of problems. So has that affected the industrialization process? Well, I can tell you that factories in Tigray, where the operations were suspended, some factories were burnt down. And it is unlikely that the investors in those factories will come back. So there has been a net loss for those companies, those investments that concentrated in the Tigray region, particularly around Mekele. They were bombed, they were ransacked, and they were, in some cases, totally destroyed. Now, for the rest of the country, the situation seems to be more under control. So most of their industrial parks haven't been really that affected by the conflict, but there is a potential outcome, which is if the perception of political instability settles, if Ethiopia is seen as a country with deep political problems and potentially a ticking bomb that might explode further in other regions, in other parts of the country in the short term, then that will be the end. I.e., most of the investors that are currently there will probably leave. And this is partly because as I said before, when you look at these maquiladoras, the amount of machinery investment that they have is minimal. The sheds where they operate are all government owned. These are government industrial parks. So all they need is to pack up their machinery, the sewing machines and all that, and leave. So any sort of perception that situation is likely to deteriorate, or if the crisis continues, and if the conflict sort of spreads or beyond Tigray, then the likely scenario is that many of these investors, which had arrived in the last 5, 6, 7 years, will definitely leave Ethiopia. And this is what I hear from people we've been talking to in the last few years, is they say, we are on the brink. We might leave any time unless there's a serious change in the situation. So that is indeed a very, very clear threat. It hasn't been materialized yet, but if nothing happens in the next few months, we will see more and more companies leaving the country. Thank you.
I think I like to say thank you, all of you, and I would like that now to pass to some sort of the issues that will be leading us to a way forward. From my side, I just mentioned particularly to Javier the negotiations of the African Free Trade Area, or African Continental Free Trade Area. At this time, we know that there are 8 regional commissions. I don't want to mention them, but I can pass them to you. And these regional commissions, what they have gained in terms of the negotiations are very important, and they should be considered an acquis, which is a word in French, which means that which has been agreed. So meaning that all that has been already negotiated by the regional commission should also be taken to the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I take the word from Carlos when he said about concerted actions. I always promote South-South cooperation, and this is very important. It means that in any single program or project in Africa, it is very important to have concerted actions among stakeholders, not only the government, but also international organizations, bilateral donors, and the civil society, including academics, what we are doing now. It is very important to know that, and I really want to mention that from your presentations, I can see and I can distinguish three or various cross-cutting issues. On the one side, the importance of the work of women. Gender issues are very important. And even the African Development Bank has been doing a lot of things on that, and also all the other organizations. By the way, I always follow the work of a very interesting organization. You may know, David, it is the TRALAC, the Trade Law Center in Cape Town. Stellenbosch, no? And they have done even a special program for trade, for women in trade, which I really, I can also pass you the information about. And I always follow the work carried out by TRALAC, no? The other cross-cutting issue is, of course, the progress of manufacturing. Yeah, I was really astonished to read what you have been doing and researching. The work I have done by Javier, for example, on the possible advantages of COVID. This is important to highlight it, no? And then on what Carlos has just mentioned, it is extremely important. And the way where you said about the changing in contracts, this is extremely important for the, to overcome or to try to overcome the problems faced by this pandemic. Another cross-cutting issue is that I think it's not only a question of about resilience of global value chains, but also why not strengthening regional value chains? Maybe Carlos could say something about that. That could be a priority because it will allow to diversify risk, reduce vulnerabilities, increase resilience, and foster industrial development throughout the African region. The other cross-cutting issue is about the role of governments to internalize the various externalities and spillover effects of the innovations and investments. And I share in this, I kept the idea by Carlos on the ways that the contracts, again, need to delete the word force majeure, no? And you can, it is a very important subject, And the other one, concerning the government, of course, there is a need to introduce an explicit regulatory and governance framework, no? On the way forward, I think we could, as a result of this interesting panel, by the way, again, congratulations, we could go on more research on policies available to address vulnerabilities resulting from COVID pandemic. Then also on the concerning, the presentation by Javier on disadvantages. African people need to know that they can use or exploit those advantages you have just mentioned. And on building resilience in GVCs, especially in relation to more vulnerable GVCs, which you have been speaking about. I would like to mention the importance not only of the negotiations of the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also, I am a former UN United Nations staff. The importance of the Sustainable Development Goals, which, by the way, they offer, so many opportunities to work on the different issues which are vulnerable, which are concerning all different countries in the world, particularly LDCs. And this is contained in the UN Agenda 2030, which is contains also good references and similar reference to the African Union strategic framework to deliver on its goal for inclusive and sustainable development for 2063. And on this, I would like to mention that there may be a call to action resulting from this panel. For example, calling all development actors, national, regional, and international development banks. This is important in order to support they are very much aware of what is happening in the different economies, and they could, participate more actively in the ways on resilience in GVCs and other, measures that may come out from your research. In the case of I would like to mention that not only the African Development Bank, but there is also the African Export-Import Bank. There are also all regional banks, and I'm very much willing to share with you some issues because this is part of my research. I would like to also mention, drawing on Alicia's mention to the TDR, Trade and Development Board from UNTAD, there is a new a booklet or a new publication, which is Trade and Development Report Update from March 2021. So they mention that there is the main concern remains a misplaced optimism on the rules, practices, and policies of the globalized economy. And the problems are there. And then they will require several years to recover employment, wages, and output and manufacturing lost resulting from COVID-19. And there is also that there is a growing evidence that COVID-19 can have lasting effects on human health, requiring dedicated medical and mental health resources, as well as an increased income support. On this, I would like to ask you if you have any further thought about the medical and the health part or the health implications of the COVID. Of course, there is also strengthening the need to overcome the inequalities and do as much as possible to promote investment and slowing productivity growth, which is creating so many problems. I recall that there are the development banks that could perhaps do something about, because they are very much aware of the role of the African Free Trade Area and also African Continental Free Trade Area, and also, the real problems affecting African countries. And I think before I give you the last minute for you to say something about, I think there is the question, can they recommend books and scientific articles? Well, okay, this is for you. And I want to ask you whether you have something else to say. From my part is okay, but I want to please send your presentations, send your references. I would like to continue in contact with you. I'm very much pleased to do it. I am in Geneva, and I am very much, I'm sure that we can continue, looking more on this, and particularly this call to action in order to support the work of UNAM. Would you like to say something more, David, Javier, and Carlos, please? David?
Thanks, Ana Maria. No, I have nothing else to add. It's been a fascinating panel. Yeah. Thank you, co-speakers. Thanks, Ana Maria, for your chairing and your closing comments. I think you captured it really, really well. So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Well, go ahead and continue your excellent research. Javier, ¿quieres decir algo más? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And Carlos, would you please end the meeting?
Yeah, I just wanted to add my view on, because I think it's been raised a number of times, and I think it's an important topic, is what can we expect from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and your point on the regional value chains. I'm slightly less optimistic about it. I think what we know from these sorts of efforts of regional integration is that they fail unless you have some basic conditions in place. One is that there needs to be a commitment for economic diversification and industrialization across African countries. Otherwise, there won't be any complementarities to build on for these free trade agreements to have any significant impact. That means that all African countries really need to get their act together in terms of massively expanding their export capabilities worldwide, not just towards other African countries, because nowadays this is how value chains work. And one of the biggest hurdles for that to succeed is the very weak connectivity and regional infrastructure, which explains why, currently I think it's only 15% of African trade is intra-Africa trade. And this is something that takes a lot of investment. It takes a long time. And unless, this issue is tackled, I don't think that the trade agreement really will have any lasting impact. Of course, it will eventually have a substantial impact once you have a modicum of value chains being created at national level and being able to complement each other across particular regions within Africa. So I can see some potential, for example, in the East Africa region, parts of West Africa, and certainly in Southern Africa. But I mean, the experience so far in the past hasn't been particularly positive. So I would.
When you mention the experience in the past, do you refer to Latin America?
SADC.
Okay.
I don't think SADC has been particularly effective or successful for countries other than South Africa. But anyway, I'll leave it there as a sort of provocation. But that is the one example of regional integration that has gone furthest in Africa, and it's pretty much not very effective for Zambia, Mozambique, and Angola, and others. So yeah, I think there's lots of questions in the air. My only final comment would be that some people say the crisis always become opportunities for significant change. But that requires agency. I remember I heard that when we had the global financial crisis in 2008, and everyone thought, the financial sector is going to massively transform itself. Well, nothing happened. The financial sector is exactly the same as it was in 2008. So I'm just hoping that the COVID crisis will have an impact in terms of everyone rethinking how livelihoods are in different countries. This issue of resilience of global value chains, connections between countries, and so on, the threats to globalization, all these will lead to some serious rethinking. But, we need to see and, watch and see what happens, because it's not guaranteed. So that is what requires some concerted action. People seizing on these opportunities and say, okay, let's do something, but do it seriously and see if that works.
Okay.
But it's been a pleasure to be here in Mexico and Boston. And thank you for the invitation and meeting the other panel members, and hope to see you again.
Okay. So do I.
Ana María, I only want to say something. Thank you very much. And don't forget to try to study the UNSCA and the NAFTA agreement, and also the CAFTA agreement, the Central America. So it will be very good to see the experience that we have had with the NAFTA and now with the UNSCA and that. But then thank you very much. It has been very interesting, this panel, and we are just on time to begin the next